Hi everybody. Today we are talking about leadership. Now, leadership, of course, impacts a lot of different things. Anytime that we're in a group, a team, an organization, even a family requires some kind of leadership, and it's something that's been studied from a variety of different perspectives for a really, really long time. Personally, I find leadership really interesting simply because there's no one size fits all kind of approach. To be an effective leader, simply in a simple sense, means that you have to be dynamic in the way that you communicate and the way that you interact with people, because effective leadership really comes down to effective communication in diverse settings and diverse contexts. So it's super important that we're thinking about that, and that's really what this lecture is going to cover, some of the different ways that we can think about, that we can analyze leadership so that we can think about it as something that is fluid, as something that is dynamic, and hopefully become better leaders ourselves. So to start, we'll have our preview. To begin, we will define what leadership is. I'll then briefly ask you to pause and think about your ideal leader. We'll then talk about one of the differences, or some of the differences between managers and leaders. And then we'll talk about leaders, where they come from, how they emerge, how they get into a position of leadership, how to become a leader, and then some of the different perspectives on leadership and some of the different ways that leadership has been analyzed and thought about over the time that we've been studying it. And then we'll end with a kind of reevaluation of your ideal leader, where I'll ask you to pause and just take a minute and think about those things again. So to begin, when we're thinking about leadership, what is leadership to you? How would you define leadership? For a lot of people, this would be talking about a person. When I ask students what a leader is to them, who a leader is, what is leadership, they think of people, not necessarily particular things. But each of those people highlights a particular approach, some particular thing that they find to be valuable, and that for them leads into being an effective leader. So this can be a coach, it can be a mentor, it can be a teacher, a boss, a manager, it can be an influencer, it can be a variety of different people. But leadership, again, it's dynamic, it's flexible. So we want to be thinking about specifically, and this is from a textbook in group communication. So the idea here is that when we're thinking about leadership, we're thinking about influence, we're thinking about relationships. So this particular definition that I really like is that a leader, follower, social influence process directed toward positive change that reflects mutual purposes of group members and is largely accomplished through competent communication. So when we're thinking about what leadership is, we're thinking about a leader-follower relationship with some kind of social influence process. That key word is going to be influence. So when we're thinking about keywords, we're thinking about key elements. We want to be thinking about influence, influence, influence. How we can influence a situation, how we can leverage our power in a different situation, that directly relates to leadership. The other thing here relates to positive change. So typically when we're thinking about leaders and followers and that relationship that develops, people don't typically follow a leader who they perceive as having their worst interests in mind, as being bad for them, right? Usually, even if it's misconstrued, if it's unreasonable, if it doesn't make sense to us, people are not going to follow somebody to do something that somebody asks if they think it's going to negatively impact them. So again, it comes down to perspective, it comes down to perception. So we have to be thinking about positive change, not in kind of a general sense, but positive change based on the perspective in which we are evaluating it from. So just for example, a really common person that I've been seeing a lot on social media is David Goggins. And a lot of people are talking about David Goggins being a positive influence. And the approach that David Goggins has is basically do things that are tough, that are challenging, that suck. And in doing that, you are able to improve your life, improve your mental capabilities to become a better person and to be better fit for being successful in life. Now, some people might say, oh no, that's not positive. Some people might say, oh, that is positive. It's a matter of perspective. But that's just one example of how depending on how you look at a situation, it can influence whether you're thinking about it in a positive or negative way. And the last element here is about competent communication. Leadership comes down to competent, effective communication between people in different settings, in different contexts. So it's super important that we're thinking about how we are interacting with people. And if we go all the way back to that transactional model, we're thinking about the feedback, we're thinking about the context, the noise, we're thinking about the process of encoding and decoding messages, of crafting a message for an audience. So we have to be thinking about, if we're in a position of leadership or we aspire to leadership, we have to get good at communication. And that means a lot of different things. You might be really effective at communicating in one setting and not so much in another. You might be a really great coach, but you wouldn't be necessarily a great teacher. So we have to think about how we can communicate in different ways. But really, leadership comes down to influence, change, and communication. If you can keep those three things in mind, it'll be really effective, really useful. And if you're looking for a really simple, practical definition, you can just think about leadership as exercising influence. And that gets you away from having to worry about the muddy waters of positive change or influence or competent communication. But when we're thinking about exercising influence, we have to think about some of the sources of influence. People are influenced by different things. People are influenced by a person, by an idea, by the way that somebody is dressed, by the way they speak, by the way they sound, by the way that they interact. Everybody is influenced by different things based on their life experiences, based on their perspective, based on their perception of things. It even comes down to language and culture and social norms and rules and values. So it's a very flexible thing. So when we're thinking about that, we have to be thinking about what are some of these sources of influence that we engage with, that we look for. Is it appearance? Is it body language? Is it credibility or appeals to ethos? Is it dependent on the context or setting? Typically, I will ask students in a class what they look for as far as credibility, as far as leadership traits in their teachers. How do they know, based on those first couple of interactions with a teacher, if that's going to be a good class, a bad class? How do we know if we're going to drop after the first or the second day? And that comes down to a lot of these sources of influence, a lot of our ability to communicate effectively. Usually that's what it comes down to, is how are we highlighting our credibility? How are we highlighting certain aspects of ourselves to influence our audience to perceive us as being more of an effective leader? This is super important because we have to be thinking about how we are leveraging that influence to impact the other people involved, because leadership requires followers. It is a relationship. You cannot be a leader if nobody wants to get on board with what you're talking about. You cannot be a leader if nobody is engaged with what you're saying, if nobody is following you in what you're saying. You have to have followers. And in doing that, that means you have to be thinking about your followers. You have to be engaged with the relationship that you have with your followers. You can think about this from like the influencer-follower relationship on social media. We have to have some kind of way to connect with those people. And oftentimes influencers or leaders are crafting messages specifically for a particular group, and they're creating a strong base. This happens all throughout group communication, team communication, organizational communication, through public relations, through politics, through mass media, through advertising. So we see this all over the place. So it's super important. Again, we're thinking about, if group members are not willing to follow a leader, then that person no longer has any influence. If they don't have any influence, they are no longer a leader. So what I'd like for you to do at this point is pause this video, take a few minutes, and think about who the ideal leader is to you. And really, this is just for yourself. So be honest, be open, be transparent. What does that person look like? What do they sound like? What characteristics do they portray? physical, psychological, right? Think about the person that you are like, yes, I want to follow that person. And what this will do is highlight some really interesting aspects of our own individual perspectives on leadership. And that's really important because it gives us an opportunity to analyze our perspectives, to analyze the way that we think, to analyze the way that we feel, and say, why is that? Maybe I should or shouldn't continue to think this way based on this, right? So think about your leaders. Think about what that person is like. Think about a character or an individual person. Think about who embodies your ideal leader. Write it down, take some notes, because we're going to circle back to this here in just a few minutes. So pause the video right now. Just take maybe 2 to 3 minutes to write this down, jot down some notes, and then start again and come back here. So once we've thought about leaders, we have to think about managers. And I honestly have not had a lot of really great experiences with management. I spent a lot of time working in customer service, from things like retail, a lot of time in restaurants, fast food, sales, and there have been very different experiences in each one of those settings, but there's a very common kind of approach, a common misconception that I came across regularly while I was working in those jobs. And that really came down to the differences between a leader and a manager. And before I started studying communication, I didn't really have the knowledge or the vocabulary to figure that out, to unpack that and to make sense of it. And now that I do, I can look back on those situations and be like, oh gosh, that makes so much sense why I was having these negative interactions with these people. So when we think about it, we have to understand that leaders and managers are different. They're different roles and they require different things. So a manager and somebody in kind of a management position is going to have a particular type of authority or influence. Now, this is authority or influence that is granted by somebody else in a higher position of authority or influence. So think about your store manager being promoted or hired into that position by a regional manager. Now, this is what we call a formal position of authority. It's appointed by somebody else from a different position of authority, usually with very little interaction from the people who are actually going to be below that manager. So just for example, I was working in a restaurant, and for whatever reason, the management, the middle and upper management, decided to fire the store manager, the general manager, and bring in somebody new. And that new person came in, and they didn't consult with any of the assistant managers. They didn't consult with any of the employees. They didn't consult with anybody about this decision. They just made the decision because they had the influence, they had the authority to do so. And when that person came in, everybody was pretty thrown off by that. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Why was nobody addressed? Nobody talked to us about this. We weren't even really aware that this was happening. And then this person came in and immediately started making major changes, and without developing any kind of relationship with anybody, which you might be thinking, yeah, that's their responsibility. They have the authority and the influence to do that. And you would be correct in that. They do. Absolutely. It's a formal position of authority. But that's one of the differences between a manager and a leader, is when we come in, we have formal positions of authority appointed to us. We have power appointed to us. We have influence appointed to us. And if we don't develop a relationship with the other people involved, we don't have followers, and we don't create a leadership situation. So that's one of the primary things, is that a manager is a formal position of authority that is typically brought in to a position to maintain a status quo. They are looking to keep things the way that they are, to enforce rules, to enforce regulations, to create a level of consistency, which is not a bad thing, right? You think about a group, an organization, a team, you want to have some consistency, especially if you're getting positive results. You want to have consistency. You want to maintain that status quo. Now, a leader will come in and typically make changes. They'll change policies. They'll change norms, expectations. They'll change rules. And that change requires a relationship, because you're creating inconsistencies, you're creating conflict, you're creating interference in the way that that group and that organization is going to function. So if you are coming into a leadership role, or you're coming into a management role and you want to embody leadership or a leader, you have to really be thinking about how you're going to go about doing that, because typically managers are there to maintain a status quo, and leaders are there to kind of guide the ship to make changes, to exert their influence. One way that leaders go about this is through transformational leadership. Now, this is the idea that a leader is going to come in and completely change the way the group functions in a positive sense. They're going to have some kind of positive impact. And this means that there's a lot of expectations on that leader. There's a lot of influence granted to that leader. There's a lot of change that's going to happen. And that means there's going to be a lot of conflict, a lot of interference, and a lot of turbulence within that organization. But these leaders, an effective transformational leader, typically focuses on developing relationships and connections with the followers, with the people they're engaged with, rather than just coming in and exerting that influence over the people they're in charge of, kind of like exerting their influence and highlighting there's a power differential or power difference, forcing people to do what they want because they can, rather than encouraging people to do what they ask and get them to do it because they want to. So just for example, we see this a lot in sports. I am kind of interested in sports, and one of the interesting things that came about recently was when the Los Angeles Rams hired a new head coach, and that head coach was finding success really early. And everybody was talking about, oh, it's such a different perspective. He's a player's coach. He's a player's coach. And I always thought that was really interesting, because really all he was doing was creating relationships with the players. And I thought that was so interesting that that was gaining some kind of notoriety. Like, oh my gosh, this coach is taking extra steps to develop a relationship with his players, and that's the key to finding success. And in my mind, I'm like, yeah, of course it is, because you have somebody coming in who's fundamentally altering this position, and they are really taking their leadership role seriously rather than a manager role, or rather just trying to force people to abide by what they want and use their influence and use their authority to force people. So I just thought that was really interesting, because it really highlighted the value of transformational leadership, and really highlighted the value of having a charismatic leader or a highly transformational leader. Now, these are the people that garner extreme devotion. When you can look through history in both positive and negative senses and look at people who garnered huge followings that were wildly devoted to them, and the followers loved those leaders and would go to extremes to make that leader happy and to follow what they were doing. So when we think about having a highly transformational leader, we think about hopefully charismatic leadership. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but from a follower perspective, it can be, because it can lead us to this idea of groupthink. And this occurs when group cohesion, group relationships are too strong, and we stop thinking critically for ourselves and start making decisions based on the group and not questioning those ideas. So there's a lot of ways to go about that, and there's a variety of different aspects to it, but groupthink is just one aspect that we can identify when we're thinking about transformational leadership. Another way to think about leadership is not necessarily transformational, coming in and changing things and creating relationships, but it's more transactional. And this is where a leader will come in and they will wield their authority over rewards and punishment as ways to coerce people into doing what they want. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That word coerce has kind of a pejorative feel to it, a pejorative definition. But it's not necessarily a bad thing if you come in and you say, hey, if we meet these goals, here are these positive things that are going to happen for everybody. So, for example, we think about coming in and saying, If we have this coach, right, for the Rams, comes in, is developing these relationships, getting people really on board with what they're doing and seeing success. Well, all of a sudden, a few years later, we have another coach at the Philadelphia Eagles who is doing something similar from a different perspective and getting this notoriety and getting this attention about being a coach that Philadelphia, the city, needed and that the Eagles needed, and that his one way that he would go about creating those relationships with his players was by wearing these different t-shirts and by being emotional and by being transparent. And in doing that, allowed that transformational aspect to lead into some elements of the transactional leadership, which really were getting raises, making it to the Super Bowl, making it to the playoffs. Every playoff win, making it to the Super Bowl, every player on that team got a monetary bonus. So there are certain levels to leadership where those transactional elements are really valuable and they can be really useful. So we have to be thinking about it not just as relationship building, not just as transactions where we can wield raises and job perks and all this stuff, but we want to bring them together and think about how in different settings can we use these different types of influence from relationships to transactional elements to improve our organizations to be a better leader. But once we think about those aspects of leadership and how we can use them, we want to take a step back and think about, okay, well, where do leaders come from? Are they born? Are they made? Well, we're going to tackle those questions in a minute, but when we're thinking about emergence and emergent leadership, we want to be thinking about those leaders coming from within an organization. So just for example, an emergent leader is somebody who earns the trust, the admiration, the followership of the group by being a part of the group. So if you've ever been in an interaction where you were part of a group and that group wanted you to be the leader, to be in charge, to speak for them, to guide the situation, that's an example of emergent leadership. Whereas designated leaders are appointed. So this is where people will say, all right, you have these traits, you have these things, you seem like the kind of person we want to have in a leadership position. And this can go really well or it can go really poorly. It depends because we don't actually know until it happens. But the two different types of leadership emergence that we see are from within the group or appointed by somebody in a position of authority. For all of you, you might be thinking about, how do I become a leader? What are some of the things that I can do? Now, there's no set recipe for becoming a leader in any one group. Every group is a little bit different, but there are some things that you can avoid. Now, there's going to be a lot of information on this slide, and we're going to go through it bit by bit. Feel free to pause as you go through, go back and type it out, write it out, take some notes. But really, these are just things to think about, things that we want to avoid when we are trying to gain leadership, when we are trying to get people to follow us and gain that level of influence. So number one is that we want to be focused on the group, not on ourselves. There's no quicker way to lose followers, to lose followership, to ruin a relationship in general than to be selfish and to be focused on yourself. You have to be thinking about that group, that team, that organization, that family as a group, and you're a part of that group, and you have to put that group before yourself. Number two is you can't be uninformed about the problems that the group's going to face. If you come in and you don't know what's going on, and you don't know how to handle the situation, you're going to damage your credibility really, really quickly. So we have to make sure that we are well informed when we enter a situation, whether from outside the group and we're hired into a position of leadership, or we emerge from within the group to a position of leadership. We have to be well informed with what is going on. The third thing here is you cannot be uninvolved. You have to be engaged. You have to be involved. This is a very common leadership thing, and that's that people want to see the leaders doing stuff. They want to see the leaders involved, getting their hands dirty, doing the work. This goes a really long way to developing those strong relationships, to showing the people that are involved in that interaction, in that leadership relationship, that not only do you care about them, do you care about the organization, but you can do the things you're asking them to do and you're willing to do those things. That's really important. Now, it's not necessarily going to be getting your hands dirty, but it might be being engaged in a group discussion or in the operations of what's going on, or stepping into a role that somebody needs help with and teaching them, coaching them through that process. You cannot, in that desire to get involved, you can't dominate the situation though. You have to be willing to have the transaction, a give and take. You might say, for example, you are in a leadership position and somebody calls out and you step in and you're like, you know what, I'll take care of it. I can handle this role. I will do this. Just tell me what to do. And then do that, right? You can't dominate that situation. So just for example, I was working at Starbucks for a time, and the store manager there did a lot of things really well. And one of the things that they did really well was when somebody would call out sick, somebody would go home, that store manager would come in and fill in whatever role that they had, and they would take on that role. So say, for example, they were really great at making drinks really quickly, and they had worked through Starbucks before they had been promoted to being a store manager. And so one day somebody called out sick, store manager comes out and it's like, okay, I'll run the bar. And it was like a Saturday morning. It was going to be super busy. And the shift supervisor then took on that leadership role, and the store manager just filled in that role of bar and didn't dominate the situation and allowed the shift supervisor to do their job and to run everything, to do what they needed to do. And the store manager just made drinks. So I saw in that experience a really effective use of this idea of getting involved but not dominating the situation. The next thing we want to do is we want to really highlight listening skills. This is super important. We have to be active listeners. We have to be engaged. You have to be aware of what's going on in your group, in your team, in your organization. This goes hand in hand with competent communication. If we are being effective communicators, we have to be able to listen. And listening is a vital aspect of effective communication and effective leadership. Then we have to be thinking about being flexible, being open-minded, understanding that we have to be able to engage with different ideas from different perspectives. Now, if you're watching this and you're in my class on Canvas, there's a video about marshmallows that you should watch, because it highlights this in a really interesting way. If you are not in my class, go to the link on YouTube and watch the video. It's about 7 minutes, and it's really interesting because it highlights the impact that being open-minded can have on a group's success. And the last thing here is we have to be emotionally aware of ourselves. We have to be emotionally aware of our group members. We have to be able to engage with our group, with our team, with our organization as human beings. Nothing ruins a relationship faster than thinking about somebody as a unit, right? As thinking of somebody as a cog in the system. It's really important that you engage with people, and there's a ton of research that shows that just by simply asking somebody, engaging with somebody on a human level, you dramatically increase their feelings of satisfaction within the group. You dramatically increase their feelings of success and happiness and cohesion within your group. Just simple things, by just talking to people, getting to know them, creating relationships. This is really important. It goes back to emotional intelligence, which I'm sure you've heard those words before. So once we think about what we need to do as a leader, we've been talking about leadership in general. We are now going to focus on some of the different research or some of the different perspectives that we can take when we're thinking about leadership. And the first perspective here is the traits perspective. Now, this individual kind of approach or ideology sees leaders as being born with unique characteristics that lead them to positions of power. So depending on your culture, society, your norms, you might think about, or if you look at your sheet of your ideal leader, you might be able to identify some traits that directly relate to leadership, or that could directly relate to leadership. And you can think about, well, does that necessarily mean that somebody with those traits is going to be a leader? And the odds are probably going to be no, not necessarily. But we want to define traits as these relatively enduring characteristics of an individual that highlights differences between people in most situations. So we're thinking about characteristics that highlight differences between people. Now, not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, but we want to be thinking about, do particular traits lead to effective leadership? Yes, no, maybe. The second perspective we want to take is the styles perspective. So this focuses on 3 different ways to be effective leaders in different situations depending on differing variables. Now, oftentimes we think about having one leadership style, and you might, but we want to be, if we want to be an effective leader in a variety of different settings, we have to be comfortable taking on these different styles. And I'll give you an example at the end that will highlight the value of being able to be dynamic in our styles. But the first style is autocratic or directive. This is also commonly referred to as more authoritarian, which can be negative. It's seen as being negative, but if you want to think about it in a different way, you can think about it as directive or autocratic. But this particular style is control-oriented and highly directive. This person in this style is going to give orders, and they're not questions, right? They are, do what I say now because I'm asking you to. This is the my way or the highway kind of approach. They're not really worried about members participating in decision making. They're very focused on completing the task, and they're not worried about developing relationships. Now you might be thinking, that doesn't sound great. But if you think about if your house is on fire and the fire department shows up, you want that whoever's in charge, the captain, the chief, to be directive, to tell the firefighters what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, and have it done right away because time is of the essence. You would probably not feel super great about a fire captain saying, all right, everybody, huddle up. Let's take 5 minutes and let's talk about how we're going to handle this particular fire, right? While your house is literally burning down, you don't want that that captain taking 5 minutes to have a little bit of a discussion, to work with and figure out how the firefighters think things should be handled. You want them to roll in and immediately get started on that, and they're going to be firing off orders, and the firefighters, because firefighting is paramilitaristic to a sense, they will do that, right? They will do it, and then later they'll come back through and they'll focus more on the social aspects, the relational aspects, the developmental member aspects, so that when they get in that situation, that high stress situation, they can do it effectively. So while we might not think, I wouldn't like that, there are certain situations where you want this kind of leader. Another style is the democratic style. So this is different from the directive or autocratic. In this particular style, encourages member participation. The aim here is to improve skills of group members. So I like to think of this more of like a coaching style. You are equally engaged with task and social orientations. You're worried about completing the thing, but you're also worried about developing relationships. You're worried about the members in your group, about them participating, about feeling involved, about being involved, about learning, and about growing. Now, this, of course, is an excellent leadership model when you are trying to create a solid, cohesive group that is effective, that's going to hold together, that's going to manage conflict well, and that's going to be successful over a period of time. But again, you wouldn't want to adopt a democratic leadership style if you are a fire captain at an emergency event, right? So we have to be thinking about when and where we should use these different styles. And then the last style is laissez-faire, and this is considered the do-nothing approach to leadership. It's very hands-off, and sometimes it's not even considered a leadership style. It's considered more of an avoidance strategy. But really this comes down to people in leadership positions, people with influence, allowing their group members to make decisions, to guide the group, to have an impact, have a role in how the group works. So again, not necessarily a bad thing. Laissez-faire and democratic styles can be really effective for creativity, for creating group cohesion. Autocratic and directive styles are great for when time is of the essence. You do not have time to try and deconstruct and create some really nuanced approach or take a new approach. You need to get something done now. Then the next perspective is the situational perspective. Now, this looks at leadership based on what a leader is comfortable with based on varying situations. So we have a few different styles that we'll talk about within the situational perspective. The first one is the selling style. So this is task and social focus. The idea is that you want your group members, your followers to be on board with the idea. You pitch the idea to them, you sell the idea to them, and you want everybody to be on board with that and to be energized and to be driven toward completing that task, which can work well in a lot of different ways. The second style is a participating style. So this is more social focused. This is where we encourage member participation. This is where the leader is getting into the thing, working with the group. So my example from the store manager at Starbucks, participating in completing the tasks rather than bringing everybody together and trying to pitch a different idea. They participated in completing that task. So that was an effective use of that style. The third style is the telling style. This is going to be, again, more directive, more autocratic, more authoritarian. It's going to be more task-oriented. You are not looking for feedback from your leader, from your followers, from the people involved in your group. You want people to do what you're asking because you're asking them to do it. And you have to do this. And this is a really effective style when you are under a time crunch. You only have a limited amount of time to go about it. The next style is the delegating style. So this is not really directive. It's low task, it's low task orientation, low social orientation. And this is going to be more of your kind of hands-off, laissez-faire kind of approach. You're going to delegate things and then sit back and watch it work, which again, depending on the situation, that can be good, that can be bad. It depends on the situation, which is the whole point of the situation perspective, is that when we have different situations, we have to adopt different styles, we have to take different approaches so that we can be effective leaders. And then the last perspective here is the readiness perspective. And this is where we think about the extent to which a follower demonstrates the ability and willingness to accomplish a specific task. Is somebody ready, and are they willing to take that task? So just for example, it would have been a bad leadership decision for the store manager to come out and say, okay, it's Saturday morning, we're super busy, let's have Adam, who I was never good at making drinks. I don't move super fast. I didn't know all the drinks really well. My best fit was on the register or at the drive-through window, having conversations with people, engaging with people. I was not ready to be put in that position, that high-stress situation where I was going to have to make drinks. So that would have been a poor decision on the leader's part, and they effectively evaluated the readiness of the people that were there and stepped in and filled that role. Now, readiness and leadership perspectives, they dictate what will make an effective leader or not. So it's when we're thinking about not necessarily particular approaches, but more about, is somebody ready? Can they do what is required of the leader? And that can be yes, no, or maybe. And depending on the situation, you're going to have different things that you have to think about. Is somebody mature enough? Are they informed enough? Are they skilled enough? Have they done the things that are required to gain that followership? Yes, no, maybe, it depends, because each group is different and appropriate leadership will depend, it will differ for each group. So we really have to be thinking about and understanding that leadership is not one size fits all. It's going to be different for everybody. And we have to think about all of the different things that come into play when we are thinking about leadership. Which gets us to the end of our lecture here. And what I'd like for you to do is just take a few minutes, pause the video, reevaluate your ideal leader. Think about the style: directive, democratic, laissez-faire. Which one do you respond best to? What situational style do you respond best to? Is it a selling style? Is it a directive style? Is it a telling style? What traits do you typically identify as being key traits for an effective leader? And overall, give us an approach, or give me an approach, give yourself an approach, and think about what makes a good leader. So just really briefly in review, we talked about defining leadership, and it really comes down to influence, hopefully positive influence, and effective communication. We want to be making positive changes. We have to be effective communicators, and we have to be able to influence the people that are following us, because leaders require followers, and that is a relationship. Then I had you briefly think about your ideal leader. We talked about managers and how managers are typically brought in and they are appointed a position of authority by somebody in a higher position of authority, and their job usually is to maintain the status quo of that situation, of that group, of that organization, to create a level of consistency, whereas leaders are going to come in and typically going to make change. It depends on the type of leadership and the approach, whether it's transactional or transformational. It also, and like what we talked about next was leadership emergence, it depends on where that leader emerges from. Is it somebody who was appointed, or is it somebody who was emerged from within the group? Because somebody who is an emergent leader is already going to have really strong relationships, but they might have a tough time with the task roles because of those relationships. So we have to be thinking about, where is that leader coming from? We talked about some things that you can avoid to help become a leader, and really some of the important things are listening, effective communication, and being selfless, so not focusing on yourself, putting the group, the organization before yourself. And then we talked about all of the different perspectives on effective leadership before having you review your ideal leader one last time. Now that gets us to the end of what is notably a rather long lecture. I hope that you learned something about leadership today, and if I can leave you with one thing, it is simply that leadership is dynamic. It changes. There is no one perfect approach. There's no one perfect way to think about it. There is no one perfect leader. Leaders vary, and an effective leader is going to be able to adopt different perspectives, different styles, different approaches, different communication patterns, different communication styles based on the needs of the group. All right, everybody, I hope you learned something. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching.